All right, this mini lecture is about tribal law, policy, and sovereignty. Before we move forward, we want to understand the difference between what is law and what is policy. And so laws are passed by legislatures and governing bodies. They can be known as statutes and acts, and tribes have the authority to pass their own laws and ordinances. They're not the same thing. And I think one of the important considerations in American Indian history and relations with the United States was that the treaties were often broken or laws maintaining American Indian title to land were not followed. And this was based on the policies of the the United States, the presidents at the time that favored removal and assimilation to honoring the treaties that were signed. And so the policies are sets of laws, rules, and regulations intended to accomplish a certain goal. And they often include an approach or are rooted in a governing philosophy. Federal Indian policy has been inconsistent over time, and Vine Deloria and Lytle stated that the efficacy of law ultimately depends on a society's perception of its ability to provide justice. But the perception is not rational, it is emotional. Indian people from the establishment of reservations were forced into a situation where they could not always perceive the justness of federal laws. And the federal laws were not always just, nor were they suited to meet the needs of many of the tribes. And so when we'll go over some of the historical things that happen and historical events, we'll see examples of where policy and law conflicted, and often the law was not followed. Sovereignty is a very important concept that we need to know. We need to walk away with a really good understanding of what sovereignty is in order to be a good advocate. American Indian sovereignty is inherent. What that means is that it derives from the people. It was not granted by the United States, nor was it granted by any other European nation that arrived after Christopher Columbus first arrived. The sovereignty has existed since before then. And sovereignty was acknowledged and reaffirmed in the United States Constitution. It's been acknowledged in court cases or case law, executive actions, and federal legislation. And when we look at history, and specifically American Indian history, it's been written from the non-Indian point of view by advocates of the position of the colonizers. So we can't really understand the current situation of American Indians without gaining some knowledge of history, how it's been formed and shaped by the experiences of the tribes with Western civilization. So it's very important to understand history and how sovereignty has been eroded over the course of time. There are two sections of the Constitution that include references to American Indians. The first one is in the Indians Not Taxed statement. And so basically, this excludes certain tribal citizens that aren't fully citizens of the United States and cannot be taxed by either states or the federal government. And then there's a Commerce Clause that relates to tribes where they are named in terms of the power that Congress has to regulate commerce. So Congress can regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the states, and with the Indian tribes. So both foreign nations and Indian tribes have the word with. So that acknowledges them as separate sovereign units outside of the sphere of the United States. And when you think of sovereignty, there's external functions of sovereignty and there's internal functions. And so the external functions are around government to government relationships, access to funding streams, access to external programs and services. And the internal functions are the tribal government and services, the regulations. Tribes have their own courts, they have their own police departments. They determine who is a tribal member. That's probably one of the most important functions of sovereignty. Education and social services can be delivered within the tribe. Health and behavioral health services can be delivered. And tribes have the ability to conduct economic development. So through tourism, and we see gaming here in Arizona. But a real important aspect of sovereignty that's kind of overlooked is the nurturing systems. So when I say nurturing systems, these are the traditions of any group of American Indian people. So we're talking about families and clans, we're talking about laws and customs, the knowledge, the indigenous knowledge and cultural knowledge, and even scientific knowledge that's passed down from one generation to the next. And they guide who you are, your beliefs. We're talking about the spiritual practices, the religious practices, the language. These are real important functions. And sovereignty and culture should not be seen as separate. They should be seen as very closely intertwined. For tribes, you can't have sovereignty if you don't maintain yourself culturally. And so that's why it's very important to think of internal sovereignty and cultural sovereignty as being a very key component as an advocate. And so this is kind of a diagram that I made about, sovereignty can be external, it's all around, and the culture is internal. And so it operates at multiple levels. The federal trust responsibility was established, and we'll talk a little bit about the court case when it was established. But broadly, the federal government should do and act in the best interests of tribes. And so a lot of this has been established through court cases and through treaties. And fiduciary duties mean that, there's a component of finance that's involved, and that's through the treaties and statutes. And then meaningful consultation is another key component of the federal trust responsibility. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a later module, but these are the real important aspects of tribal sovereignty that we want you to start to understand. And from here on out, we're going to be talking about sovereignty. And by the time you're done with this course, we want you to have a good grasp on how sovereignty is really the most important thing to understand as an advocate. So the next lecture, we'll talk about the actual historical events that occurred.